Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Thursday, February 3rd, 2022, and today we're going to be talking about the state of Nevada and a brand new poll from the Nevada Independent that shows Catherine Cortez Masto, the Democrat incumbent in this Senate race, defeating her Republican potential opponent by about 9 percentage points, up from just a 5-point lead that was established back in September of 2021. And another thing also, the governor's race was recently polled, in which we found that the Nevada Independent also shows the incumbent governor Steve Sisolak up against his Republican contenders by some pretty substantial amounts compared to his previous leads. Back in September, Steve Sisolak led by 3 points against the former senator Dean Heller, who actually ran in 2018 and lost. He is now up by 8 points against that candidate. And taking a look at the governor's race against, I believe, Lombardo is how you pronounce it fully, Steve Sisolak defeats him by 4 points after being only up by about 1 percentage point back in September. So it is a very interesting thing that at this point in time, we are seeing an increase and rise in support for the Democratic Party, despite overall Joe Biden and the Democrats nationally falling to a worse position from when it was back in the month of September. In fact, when you take a look at that exact time frame in which there was polls from the state of Nevada, you might find that the approval rating and the disapproval rating were the disapprove above the approve by about 5 percentage points across the nation. And with that, considering the fact that Nevada was just a few points to the right of the national average, it sort of means that the state itself is a bit more conservative in comparison to this national number, which means Joe Biden and the Democrats should be performing worse now, considering that the approval rating went from being 46% all the way down to just 42% in the time between the first poll from the Nevada Independent and the most recent one. In addition to that, the generic ballot, back when that first poll was taken, actually had the Democrats up by about 3 percentage points nationwide. Today, the Republicans now have a 4-point advantage, meaning there was a 7-point swing nationally, but the Nevada numbers don't seem to reflect that. In fact, they reflect the exact opposite of the circumstance. And an interesting thing about this is that the polling numbers in the state of Nevada almost always lean towards the right in terms of overestimation. So in 2016, it said that Donald Trump was going to win the race in that competitive presidential election in Nevada. In 2018, they said Dean Heller was going to win the Senate election. The polls said that Adam Laxalt was going to win the governor election, and these were wrong, overestimations for the GOP that were simply the fault of the polls. And the fact that there is now a number showing Catherine Cortez Masto up 9 points, showing the Democrats up by 8 points, or by a smaller amount when it comes down to this race, 4 points. At the end of the day, historically speaking, Nevada polls tend to overestimate Republican support. Now, the interesting thing about this advantage for Cortez Masto is that it comes out of a surprise improvement in approval rating for both Steve Sisolak and Catherine Cortez Masto. What you find in these numbers that you see Steve Sisolak increase relative to where he was before. Let's see if we can find the exact approval rating, because it is something to point out. They wrote an entire article about it, and we can sort of see the questions end up filling out as we go further. Let's go ahead and find the approval rating here. So they asked the voters, do you have a favorable view or an unfavorable view of Steve Sisolak? What do you think about him currently being in office? And what you find is that he's actually approved of or favored by 11 points more than he has an unfavorability rating, which means there's a significant amount of voters here above those who dislike him that like him. And I think that's really what is driving this lead of 8 points or 4 points. If people like you, you're more than likely going to be reelected. One thing that I do want to say, though, that I caution against this is the fact that there is something to be said about the generic congressional vote shifting in terms of the national numbers. I mean, from what I have seen so far, the Democrats actually aren't seeing super substantial hits relative to the generic congressional vote for whatever reason, and it could very well kick in later down the line. Once voters actually know who the Republican nominee is going to be, it becomes a lot easier to back that said Republican nominee than it does to say at this point in time you are unsure about how you are going to vote. Generally speaking, everyone coalesces around one candidate by the time the general election reaches November, which means that the numbers should narrow up. There is no way that we are going to see, especially in our national environment, that Catherine Cortez Masto wins by 9 points, but the fact that she's up so high definitely is a testament to her ability to potentially win re-election. But again, I caution that in saying that these are not going to be the final numbers. But, taking a look at the 2018 numbers, the Nevada Independent, it wasn't exactly too far off. In the Senate election, and like I said, they said that the RCP average was going to be a tie. In fact, depending on where you looked at for the weeks leading into the election, they said that Dean Heller was going to win. But the Nevada Independent did a poll way earlier on in the race. They did one in April of 2018, and they found that Dean Heller in this poll was actually up by about 1 point. Now, this one was wrong in terms of the Senate race, but they actually got it pretty accurate when it came down to the governor's race, and I was quite surprised. But if anything that they were wrong about, it was the amount of Republican support statewide, and that's where I start to see some concerns for the GOP, because even if the Nevada Independent wasn't necessarily reputable in terms of its most recent poll in 2018, there is something to be said about the fact that it overestimated Republican support. But taking a look at the polls from the governor race, what you find is that they said Steve Sisolak was going to win by 6 points. He ended up winning by 4.1. Very interesting to say the least. Now, in 2018, there were no incumbents in these races. Both of these candidates here were running in an open race. Adam Laxalt, I believe, was the attorney general. And, looking at the Senate race, it was not an open race. Dean Heller was the incumbent, so you pretty much knew who the Republican nominee was going to be. And maybe that could contribute to the fact that in the Nevada Senate race, there was an overestimation of Republican support, an overestimation of the undecided voters here who might not necessarily have known Jackie Rosen at that point, who definitely know her now. And potentially in this open race, the reason why it was more accurate was because it was an open race, because there was no type of incumbency bias because of people recognizing names versus not recognizing names. So keep that in mind as well. Democrats might be up simply because they are more well known against these Republican contenders, but the approval rating definitely speaks for itself when it comes down to Steve Sisolak. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to find the approval rating for, let's see, we can view the entire results of the poll. That way we can go ahead and take a look at a breakdown. Let's see here. So in going through it, what you are going to find is that amongst the voters here, and let's see if we can actually get it loaded up, I wonder if they ask a question about the approval rating of the Senator, Catherine Cortez Masto. I believe we are not seeing that immediately, so we're going to go ahead and just move on and take a look at this article because it does cover some main reasons why Democrats might be receiving an increase in support relative to September, but I don't believe we're going to be able to find an approval rating for Catherine Cortez Masto. But like I showed you, the approval rating there is 50%, 39%, but one thing that actually has a pretty much bigger increase for the Democrats is the COVID-19 policies. Now, looking at our COVID cases across the nation, people are a bit worried. I think that we know the Omicron variant is much more transmissible. People are testing a lot more frequently. People have at-home tests. People are wearing KN95s now. And with that concern comes an ask and a want for more COVID policies. Not necessarily restrictive COVID policies, but safety precautions put in place to ensure the safety of all residents. And that's what happened in the state of Nevada. Steve Sisolak took a hit when he took some more extreme COVID stances when it came down to policies. And I say extreme relative to the median, which is somewhere around little to no COVID restrictions, considering many of these states have completely lifted all types of restrictions across the nation. But that did give him a dip in approval, and that's why back when some of these polls were originally taken, he was only up by about 1 point against his potential Republican contender, or up by a margin of just 3 points. And then the Trafalgar Group came out with a poll that showed Dean Heller ahead by 7 points. In 2018, they inaccurately predicted the governor's race and the Senate election, so I would take their poll with a grain of salt. Sometimes, and almost always actually, they overestimate Republican support, and I want you to keep that in mind when you take a look at their +7 poll for Dean Heller. But, in looking at the reason why there might not necessarily have been such a large lead for the Democrats in the state of Nevada, it could have been because the voters were negatively responding to some of these COVID protocols, or negatively responding to some of the policies that they might have viewed as more extreme. Because Nevada isn't a blue state. It just votes blue. It's a state that is a swing state, can go back and forth, has gone back and forth, had a Republican governor as recently as 2018. So keep that in mind as well. Looking at 2019, in fact, looking at the Senate race and the governor's race in the state of Nevada, it is entirely possible that these races go red. And as of right now, I still, at least in my most recent projection, expect them to go red. I think there's going to be a lot of enthusiasm and energy that Democrats need to re-excite in the state in order to win like they did in 2018. But also, looking at some of these numbers, it becomes increasingly more likely and increasingly more understandable to see how Democrats could still win despite Joe Biden falling out of public favor nationwide, especially taking a look at some of these previous polls that shows an overestimation for the Republican Party by a pretty significant amount. I mean, you're talking about being 5 points off in both the Senate races and the governor's races, and if that's actually a skew in favor of the Democratic Party, I wonder what it will look like for 2022. Looking at the state of Nevada, though, again, the main thing about the Senate race there and the governor's race there is that Republicans are practically running in an open type of primary because there is no incumbent. The thing about the Senate race is that we pretty much know who it's going to be. Adam Laxalt is a very well-known name. He is the the former attorney general, ran for governor in 2018. And, looking at the polls, he has a pretty substantial lead, and he probably is going to be the only one who actually makes it that far. That's why there is actually polling data between Catherine Cortez Masto and Adam Laxalt, despite the fact that the primaries have not occurred. But looking beyond the Senate elections, what you have to take a look at are the governor elections. That is another race in which we do not know who the Republican nominee is going to be. And unlike the 2022 Nevada Senate race, the governor's race here actually has a competitive Republican primary. The Democrats, however, do not. Taking a look at the list here, what do you have? You have some pretty recognizable names, at least for Nevada Republicans. The top two here are Dean Heller and Joe Lombardo. We will see what happens in that primary. It looks like the polling data seems to have gone back and forth between Dean Heller being up and now all of a sudden Joe Lombardo. Because taking a look at the poll back in July of 2021, Dean Heller had a lead. He had 27% of the support to Joe Lombardo's 22%. Then the Mailman Group, a Democratic-leaning pollster, did another poll in September that showed Dean Heller at 31% and Joe Lombardo at 23%. Then came November. The Terrence Group, a Republican-leaning pollster, gave Joe Lombardo 37% of support to Dean Heller's 19%. And in the most recent OH Predictive Insights poll, which I do trust and is the only nonpartisan poll that we've seen in this primary, shows Joe Lombardo at 28% to Dean Heller's mere 9%. So Dean Heller definitely has gone from being a top-tier candidate, the number one frontrunner, to now potentially losing against Joe Lombardo, who is currently the sheriff of Clark County. I think he's definitely going to be running on some type of campaign dealing with the police and things of that nature. But it is very interesting to see how we are looking at Joe Lombardo and Dean Heller pretty much face off against each other for this Republican primary, which can also sort of tell us why there is no clear support for a singular Republican, simply because the Nevada governor's race is currently in a position where we don't know who the GOP nominee is going to be. But that doesn't really make an excuse for Adam Laxalt, someone who should be a recognizable name and actually did not necessarily fairly well, but did come pretty close considering the national environment. So, overall, what I think from this national circumstance and from the state of Nevada with these polling numbers, I think that the Democratic Party must be doing at least something mildly correct, or potentially voters might not necessarily care about Joe Biden anymore. I think this has become a reemerging theme. Not only in Nevada, not only in, other states, in many of these swing states, what I have found is that despite Joe Biden being disapproved of by the most recent poll saying 16 points more than he is approved of across the nation, the Senate races, the governor races, and many of these House races are not being negatively receptive to Democrats as a result of it. I think that's the most shocking part of it all, that voters are not rejecting Democratic ideals and Democratic Party candidates simply because they dislike Joe Biden. And that's very different than when it was under President Trump, very different than when it was under President Obama, very different than really all of the modern day presidents. And it might just be the fact that Democrats are still able to win over voters, or potentially that Republicans can't. And that's also a major point of concern. I made a video about this the other day talking about how Republicans have failed to capture in the vote, potentially because they might have a significant portion of the population that associates them with Donald Trump, the losing candidate from 2020, or might associate them with the Capitol insurrection. Those type of images are very hard to shake. Even though voters might disapprove of Joe Biden in the same poll, for instance, right here, taking a look at the Politico Morning Consult poll, voters disapprove of Joe Biden by 11 points more than they approve, yet Democrats are actually winning more of the vote than those who approve of Joe Biden. There are voters out there that disapprove of Biden that are willing to vote for Democrats, and the disapprove being at 54, yet the Republicans' vote share only being at a total number, 54 versus 41. That is a super significant decrease. That is a super significant difference. And I think that's really where the shocking part comes from it all. But at the end of the day, taking a look at it on a more local and statewide level, it does benefit the Democratic Party very tremendously. Because if they are able to survive in 2022, despite Biden being down, that election is said and done. The GOP wave is no longer. If Democrats can sustain their popularity, and if Democrats can maintain their electoral advantages in many of these states despite Biden being so desperately disapproved of, that's when the moment of concern should come in for the GOP. Because then maybe it won't be a concern when it comes down to Joe Biden's reelection bid. And, you could bring up the fact that Virginia and New Jersey got closer than they actually, quote unquote, should have. But looking at the polling numbers, Virginia was accurately predicted. The polling averages by the end of the Virginia governor's race said that there would be a Glenn Youngkin victory. Right now, we're not seeing that in many of these swing states. There are very few in which Republicans are now taking the lead, Georgia being one of them, but in Nevada, as we now know, simply that is not the case. In New Jersey, the polling numbers narrowed it down. I made a video talking about it before the election, about how surprisingly enough the polling numbers were narrowing down, but I didn't know whether or not to believe them, simply because it is a state that isn't traditionally polled. There aren't, all of these networks that polling companies use like they might in routine states such as Florida or North Carolina or Georgia. But looking at the results there, it ended up narrowing up. And what happened in the election? It ended up narrowing up as well. Polling data is still an accurate indicator, and it was very accurate in 2021, and I do trust it enough to tell us where we are currently today. Main takeaway, despite Biden being down nationwide, being down in Nevada, the Democrats survive in both the governor election there and the Senate election if the election was held today. I think this is a very impressive feat by the Democratic Party in the state of Nevada, but by no means is this race said and done. The margins here may seem strong, but keep in mind once that GOP primary is fully said and done in the governor's race, and we actually start to see an increased attention focus from the GOP in Nevada Senate race and the governor's race, expect many of these numbers to narrow up, but it isn't out of the question for Democrats to win at all. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.